I was reborn on the day my father and mother got divorced. My mother and I were kicked out of the house. My father said, "I have no money for you. Just pretend you don't have a father like me." I took out the agreement to sever the father-daughter relationship and asked him to sign it. Don't just pretend. Let's put it in writing. It's hilarious. In my previous life, I was a stock market wizard, familiar with every dark horse stock of those years. I was even afraid that he would come to mooch off me when I got rich. After the car accident, I went back to the year when my father and mother got divorced. When I opened my eyes, my father was throwing out the luggage of my mother and me. As he threw, he said, "This won't be your home anymore. Don't forget to leave the keys for me." My stepmother was smiling behind him and said, "There's no need to leave the keys. Things used by others are so dirty. I'll change the locks later." My father immediately nodded and turned back to smile at my stepmother with a wrinkled face. Okay, I'll do whatever you say." Damn it. This plot seems somewhat familiar. I glanced at the calendar on the wall. Sure enough, it was that year in my previous life, because of what my stepmother said about changing the locks. I had an argument with her and was even pushed by my father, staggering and hitting my head on the doorframe, leaving a scar. Now I touched my head. Fortunately, it was still smooth. I craned my neck to look downstairs. Good. My mother was still dealing with the luggage, completely unaware of what was happening here. So, I walked straight towards my father. In my previous life, because of that scar, I went to learn Taekwondo and had already reached the black belt level before the car accident. Now, this skill is firmly with me. Let's see who dares to bully me. I pointed at my father and smiled at my stepmother. Oh, you're using someone else's used husband, living in someone else's lived-in house. What isn't second-hand for you? And you're still talking about being dirty or not? Aren't you disgusting? My stepmother's face changed drastically. She tightly grasped my father's sleeve, and tears were already glistening in her eyes. "Ethan, are you just going to let your daughter bully me like this? I haven't even entered the family yet and I'm being treated like this by her. Will there be any place for my daughter and me in the future? It seems I shouldn't have married you. I'm an innocent person. If it weren't for loving you and taking this wrong step, why would I be talked to like this by a junior like her?" With her crying like this, my father's temper flared up immediately. His other hand was already raised. It seemed that he was about to slap me. I knocked him down to the ground with a roundhouse kick and giggled at him. "Oops, sorry. It was an instinctive reaction. Are you hurt? Is your chin swollen?" My father staggered to his feet while covering his chin, and my stepmother was completely dumbfounded by this unexpected turn of events, even forgetting to cry. I smiled at her, and she very sensibly hid behind my father immediately. "Ethan, your daughter even dares to hit you. How will I survive in the future?" My father was incited by her and was gnashing his teeth, wanting to raise his hand to hit me again. I had a calm expression on my face but gave my father a sharp look. "You'd better think it through before confronting me. Otherwise, it'll be you who suffers, Dad." My father touched his chin and finally didn't dare to lay a hand on me again, but that didn't stop him from yelling curses. "This is outrageous. How could I have given birth to such an unfilial daughter like you?" I smiled charmingly. "What bad luck. How could I have a heartless bastard of a father like you?" My stepmother tugged at my father's sleeve again, and my father was about to explode. I opened the door wide and wailed at the top of my lungs. "Uncles, aunts, neighbors, come and see. Ethan is favoring his mistress over his wife." With all my might, this shout crashed down like a thunderclap in the empty corridor, immediately causing many doors of the neighboring households to open. Actually, everyone had already heard about the affair between my father and my stepmother, but my mother was a proud person. After learning about my father's scandal, she almost immediately agreed to the divorce. She neither cried nor made a fuss, which made these people who like to watch the fun lose the chance to show off their moral superiority. Today, knowing that our family was getting divorced, who knows how many people were eavesdropping at their doorsteps, just waiting for our family to make a scene. Of course, I couldn't let go of such an opportunity to make my father famous. After all, being secretly talked about by everyone is completely different from being pointed at to your face. I pinched my thigh hard and with teary eyes, I started my performance. Everyone here is in the same system as my father. Everyone knows a little about our family's affairs. My father is a Phoenix man from the countryside. Without my grandfather paving the way for him, he wouldn't be where he is today. My mother is a young lady from the military. Marrying him was already a step down for her. He doesn't know how to be grateful and cherish what he has. He was completely charmed by a vixen who sells New Year's goods at the entrance of our community. His affair is so low class. My mother was too ashamed to say anything and swallowed all the bitterness by herself. Who would have thought that he'd go from bad to worse? Now, not only does he want to divorce my mother, but he doesn't even want me, his own daughter, anymore. He's in such a hurry to make room for his stepdaughter. Today, I haven't even moved out yet, and he's already asking me for the keys and telling me that this house won't be my home anymore. Grandparents, uncles, aunts, listen. Is this reasonable? Does it mean that just because my father and mother are divorced, I'm not my father's daughter anymore? And this house isn't my home anymore? Woo-woo. I was so angry that I argued with my father for a couple of sentences. Unexpectedly, he hit me. From childhood to adulthood, he never laid a finger on me. Today, for a vixen, he hit me. He was unkind first, and yet he has the nerve to say I'm unfilial. Please judge for me. Originally, I was just crying for show, but when I thought of all the things my father had done in my previous life, I couldn't help but get really emotional in the end and burst into tears, crying myself into a pitiful little cabbage. Seeing me crying so pitifully, the neighbors couldn't help but feel compassion and started to point fingers at my father and stepmother. I've been disliking Ethan for a long time. He doesn't even want his own daughter. He's really not a human being. That vixen doesn't even look that good. Has Ethan been hexed or something? Even a tiger doesn't eat its cubs. This is not just being ungrateful. It's downright beastly. And so on, there were countless such remarks. My father was furious. He desperately tried to drag me into the house, but I struggled desperately to stay outside. Let's talk right here. Don't even think about dragging me in. Don't think I don't know you want to hit me again. Finally, my father was exasperated. Diana, if you keep this up, don't ever expect to come back and ask me for money. Hearing this, I couldn't help but burst into laughter and said, as if you'd give it to me even if I asked. In my previous life, right after my parents got divorced, it was the start of the new semester of Senior 3, and the teacher asked us to pay the tuition fees. At that time, my mother was hospitalized due to a heart disease. I was afraid of disturbing her, so I went directly to Ethan to ask for the tuition fees. Originally, since I was still under 18, he was obligated to pay my tuition fees and living expenses. What happened? When I explained my purpose, Ethan's first words were, "Did your mother send you here?" The second sentence was, "My money doesn't come from thin air. Ask your mother for the tuition fees." Then he rolled up the window of his BMW. Through the gap in the window, I saw my stepmother and her daughter Grace sitting in the car. Grace looked at me smugly, as if she was the apple of my father's eye while I was a beggar. Remembering this scene from the past, I almost wanted to slap my father in the face, but I couldn't. I still had a brilliant move to make. Just then, my mother came upstairs. Perhaps because he didn't dare to hit me and could only provoke my mother, my father said to me in front of all the neighbors, "You can go. Just pretend I never had a daughter like you." When my mother was about to punch him, I grabbed her hand. The neighbors all accused him of being an immoral father. I whispered in my mother's ear, "Don't do it." I was waiting for him to say this. Immediately after, I calmly took out a pen and paper from my luggage bag, quickly drafted an agreement, asked my father to sign and put his fingerprint on it, and asked everyone to be witnesses. Ethan frowned as he looked at the agreement. I then read out the content of the agreement aloud. "Dear neighbors, you all heard it with your own ears. My father said that he would just pretend he never had a daughter like me. Since he is unkind, ungrateful, and unjust, and doesn't want to be a decent person, then I, Diana, don't ask him to be my father either. Today, I ask all of you to be witnesses for me. Ethan and Diana will permanently sever the father-daughter relationship from this date. From now on, whether Ethan goes bankrupt, gets scammed, suffers from a serious illness, or gets killed in a car accident, it has nothing to do with me, Diana." The neighbors were all shocked, and there were also some busybodies who shouted, "Well done." Under the pressure, Ethan quickly signed his name and put his fingerprint on the agreement. Then, I took my mother and left the scene. Originally, my mother still wanted to take that last piece of luggage, but I said, "Forget it. Throw the garbage away. It's tainted with bad vibes and will affect our new life. My mother looked at me in surprise, but soon she smiled and said, "Okay, I'll do whatever my daughter says." At this time, an aunt who was on good terms with my mother stepped forward and wiped away my tears. "Live a good life and make something of yourself. Show that blind father of yours. Right. You two should take good care of yourselves in the future. It's not worth it for a scumbag like him." Amid the chatter of blessings from the neighbors for me and my mother, my father's face was so swollen with anger that it looked puffy. And my stepmother had already hidden inside the house, not daring to come out. Now you know it's embarrassing. Too late. I believe that after today's incident, if my father and stepmother have any sense of shame, they'll probably sell the house and move away immediately. And next year, the housing prices in this community will experience an unprecedented increase. Thinking that they'll regret selling the house for the rest of their lives in the future, I could hardly hold back my laughter. Ethan, Amelia, you two won't be able to live as smoothly and comfortably as you did in your previous life this time around. Would you owe me and my mother? I'll get back every single bit. Before going back to the new rented house with my mother, I took my mother to eat Donpa braised pork at Mejo Donpa restaurant. In my previous life, my mother was afraid of getting fat. Although she liked their braised pork, she always refrained from eating it for the sake of losing weight. In this life, I don't want my mother to lose weight. Sure enough, when eating the braised pork, the corners of my mother's mouth were always curved upwards. My mother is a beauty. Although the divorce had made her look a bit haggard, when she smiled, her eyes and brows curved, still looking bright and charming. I was touched. Remembering the previous life, it seemed that since the divorce, the corners of my mother's mouth had always been drooping. I always thought that, like me, my mother couldn't get over the shadow of the divorce because she was reluctant to accept it. But looking at my mother now, it seemed that she hadn't been affected too much by the divorce. So was it possible that, in my previous life, a large part of my mother's depression was because of me? I couldn't help but think of today in my previous life. I had my head broken by my father, and my mother fought with my father, but in the end, my father wouldn't even send me to the hospital. After I got treated in the hospital, my mother hugged me and said, "From now on, you should just pretend you don't have a father like him." But I couldn't accept this reality at all back then. I couldn't figure out why my father was nice to Grace but not to me. After all, I was his real daughter. I thought Grace had snatched my father away. I competed with Grace in everything at school, but I always failed. When my father bought a new mobile phone for Grace, I broke it. If I couldn't have something, she shouldn't enjoy it either. My stepmother ran to the school and scolded me in front of my mother. "You have a mother who gave birth to you, but no one to raise you properly." I immediately cursed back at her with all kinds of foul language, both in Chinese and English, using the nastiest words I could think of. I didn't care at all that I was acting like a shrew in front of the whole school's teachers and students, and my mother was so embarrassed that she couldn't even lift her head. Later, my father slapped me and confronted my mother on the spot. "Elizabeth, is this the daughter you've brought up? The upbringing of your Elizabeth family really amazes me." But even in such an embarrassing situation, my mother still shielded me behind her and scratched my father's face all over. I still remember clearly the words she said when confronting my father. "What's wrong with the daughter I brought up? Is it wrong for her to just want her own father to look at her more? You scumbag and that slut loving each other so much. I find you disgusting and don't want to bother with you. But that doesn't mean what you two are doing isn't dirty and disgusting. Why can you do it? Can't my daughter say anything about it? Ethan, you should be grateful that your own daughter doesn't find you dirty and is still willing to try every means to make you look at her again. But you don't deserve it. Just be a good father to your stepdaughter. My daughter doesn't need you anymore. I'm telling you here and now that if you dare to lay a finger on her again in the future, I'll risk my life to make you pay. Just see if I dare." Perhaps intimidated by my mother's imposing manner, my father left with a crazy woman and escorted my stepmother and her daughter away. Later, he used his connections to transfer Grace to another class, just to keep her away from me. And I, who was left behind, almost got a major demerit for repeatedly picking on Grace. Finally, it was only after my mother begged various people that this record wasn't put in my file. That day when my mother picked me up and took me home, she said to me very sadly, "Diana, Mom is sorry for you. I couldn't give you a father who loves you. But your life ultimately belongs to you. Even if your father doesn't love you, you still have to live well." After saying these words, My mother went into the kitchen. I saw her secretly wiping away her tears in the kitchen. I actually really wanted to go in and hug her and say to her, "Mom, you haven't let me down. I'm already very happy to have you." However, the awkwardness of being a teenager finally held me back from stepping into the kitchen. That was the most regrettable thing in my previous life. That night, my mother made me a very delicious plate of fried rice with eggs, but she didn't eat a single bite herself. I secretly made up my mind to live well and never make my mother sad again. But at that time, it was already very close to the college entrance examination. Because I had wasted more than half of the school year, even though I worked really hard in the remaining time, in the end, I only managed to get into an ordinary undergraduate program. And Grace was admitted to a key university. My father even threw a big banquet to celebrate for her. It was said that my stepmother went around telling others, "Elizabeth always looks down on everything with her nose in the air. She despises this and that. It's a pity that she's strong-willed but not fated to be successful. She's taught her daughter so badly that she didn't even do as well as my Grace in the exams," which really made my Ethan angry. I just advised Ethan that children have their own destinies. No matter how angry you are, if your daughter doesn't strive for herself, what's the use? Fortunately, you're now raising Grace. Isn't Grace also your daughter? You've really made a great deal this time. When others relayed these words to my mother, they imitated her tone vividly. My mother didn't say anything, but who wouldn't feel aggrieved upon hearing such words? Probably because of feeling aggrieved and suffocated for such a long time. My mother suffered from heart failure in my sophomore year. When it was detected, it was already in the terminal stage. The doctor said that the only way to save her was to have a heart transplant. At that time, I was in college and my mother had applied for early retirement due to her health problems. The financial situation of the family could be imagined. I had no choice but to go and beg my father to lend me money to pay for my mother's heart transplant. What greeted me, of course, was only my stepmother's sarcastic remarks. I'll never forget that my stepmother stood in front of me, looking down on me and said, "Diana, your father and mother are already divorced. Before you were 18, it was your father's obligation to support you. Now that you're already an adult, your father has no obligation to you anymore, let alone to support your mother. What is your mother to your father? After the divorce, they're strangers. Do you know what your behavior of coming here and making such a request is? It's moral blackmail, commonly known as shamelessness. And your mother is supposed to be a young lady from a scholarly family. Is this the kind of person she's taught you to be?" And my father at that time just cowered inside the house, pretending not to be at home, and let my stepmother scold me. Even more infuriating was that, 2 days later, my stepmother even ran to the hospital to lecture my mother. "What's the use of you being proud all your life? Your daughter is still begging me to pay for your medical bills like a dog. I say, you're just fated to be unlucky and get this disease. One should not fight against fate. You're just doomed to die. Just die quickly." Unable to bear this any longer, in my mother's hospital ward, I scratched my stepmother's face all over. That was the saddest day in my previous life. Soon, my stepmother cried and called the police. When I was making a statement at the police station, my mother passed away alone in the hospital. The message my mother left for me before she died was written on a piece of paper, with only 3 words, "Live well." I cried my heart out. At 19 years old, my world went dark. Later I studied like crazy. With a fierce determination to destroy everything, I finally entered the financial circle and became a female stock market wizard. The first thing I did after achieving success was to bankrupt my father, and even made him have a cerebral infarction from anger. My stepmother pushed my paralyzed father to my company, going around playing the victim and saying that I was unfilial. I didn't care at all. I'm not afraid to tell anyone that I have plenty of money now, but I'd rather throw it on the street than spend it on my father. My father sued me in court. In front of my father, I donated all my assets to the impoverished mountainous areas. I had not a single penny left on me, so naturally, I couldn't afford to pay alimony to my father. Seeing that there was no way to squeeze any money out of me, my stepmother completely abandoned my father and left him to me. I simply threw my father out onto the street, leaving him to fend for himself. My actions were highly controversial. Some people on the internet said, "She's so genuine. Well done. That scumbag of a father deserves it." While others said, "She's gone too far. After all, he's her biological father." But I didn't care at all about what others said. I was living just for revenge. Of course, I wasn't going to let my stepmother have an easy time either. Not long after my father died, I hired a man to pretend to be a wealthy merchant to seduce my stepmother. Eventually, I tricked her into losing everything and she committed suicide by jumping off a building. Although my stepmother got what she deserved, I was also killed by Grace in a car accident. In my previous life, because of my father and my stepmother's family, I lost my only relative. And in order to take revenge on my father and stepmother, I gave everything I had but didn't get any happiness or joy in return. In this life, first of all, I must keep my mother by my side. I will never let my mother be sad because of me again. I want to make her the happiest mother in the world. I held my mother's hand and put another piece of meat on her plate, telling her, "Mom, you still have me. I will definitely make you happy." My mother looked at me with relief, her eyes smiling. Mom is an adult. How could I rely on you for my happiness? Speaking of this, my mother sighed. As long as you aren't affected by the divorce between me and your father and study hard, Mom will be content. I made a face at my mother and promised repeatedly, "Then don't worry. Your daughter is quite sensible." I analyzed it with my mother one by one. Dad betrayed you. That's ungrateful and unjust. Choosing a woman like Amelia shows he has no judgment. Such an ungrateful, unjust, and love-struck scumbag like him surely won't have much good fortune. He might be doomed any day. We left him early. It's like God is saving us. I'm more than happy about it. Only a fool would be affected by him. My mother looked at me and burst out laughing, but immediately she felt it was unkind to laugh and quickly stifled her laughter, putting on a serious face. "Where did you learn these mean words, child? Don't say them again. You should pay attention to your upbringing. Hee. You clearly enjoyed listening to them, even though you won't let me say them." Oops. I accidentally blurted out what was on my mind. My mother glared at me, but I wasn't afraid of my mother at all, because the feeling of being back with my mother again was so wonderful. In this life, I decided to be a sweet and caring daughter to my mother, to act all cute and naughty like I never did in my previous life. I stuffed a piece of meat into my mother's mouth. "Tell me, weren't you happy when I completely defeated them just now?" After eating the meat I cooked, my mother couldn't hold back her laughter anymore. It would be too hypocritical to say I wasn't happy. We, mother and daughter, looked at each other and burst into laughter. A long-lost sense of happiness welled up in my heart. So, happiness needs to be nurtured by love. This was a feeling that I had never experienced again after losing my mother in my previous life. At night, lying in the small rented house of my mother's, I had a wonderful sleep. In my previous life, fighting with those scoundrels out of hatred, I actually never had a single good, solid sleep. In this life, with all my skills, my mother and I will surely be able to live a great life. Looking forward to the future with my mother, I soon fell asleep. But when I woke up in the middle of the night because I needed to pee and went to the toilet, I found my mother sitting in the living room, sighing and repeatedly pressing the calculator in her hand. It seemed that she was calculating the money. Seeing me come out, my mother looked up and asked me, "Tell me, should we buy an air conditioner first or a refrigerator first? It'll be hot until month in this weather. I'm afraid you'll be too hot to study if we don't buy an air conditioner. But if we don't buy a refrigerator, we'll have to finish all the food in one meal. Mom only has enough money to buy one thing for now." I went over and hugged my mother's neck full of confidence. "Buy the air conditioner first. We should finish the food in one meal anyway. Mom, if you're worried about money, I've been learning about stock trading recently and have some insights." My mother's eyes widened. I gathered my thoughts, trying not to show off too much. "I'll tell you about a few stocks first. You can check their trends. If these stocks go up, it means I have a unique eye. Mom, you can buy a few more to try." I was waiting for my mother's praise, but unexpectedly, my mother flew into a rage on the spot. She sprang to her feet, her eyes red. "Diana, are you trying to make me mad? You're in Senior 3 and not studying hard but researching stocks instead. Do you even want to go to university?" Alas, I had calculated everything but didn't expect my mother to react like this. Afraid of giving myself away, I quickly begged for mercy and escaped back to bed on the pretext of getting up early for school. After lying down, I was wide awake and started to plan how on earth I could easily lead my mother to a good life. It's the year. I remember that the initial price of Bitcoin seemed to be less than a cent. In fact, as long as I hoard enough bitcoins, I'll be able to completely outdo my father in this lifetime and easily achieve a laid-back life. However, thinking about the past incident in my previous life when my mother was looked down upon by my stepmother because my college entrance examination results were not as good as Grace's, I think I must study hard. At present, obviously, there's nothing that would make my mother happier and annoy my father and stepmother more than getting the first place in exams and getting into Harvard University. In this life, I'm going to change my strategy. I'll improve the lives of my mother and me in all aspects, so as to silently drive my father and stepmother crazy with anger. For these two people, what could be more annoying than seeing our mother and daughter living a good life? Hehe. So, I must study hard. In the dark, I turned on the light and opened my textbooks. I found that math and English were no longer a problem for me at this moment. After all, I had a solid foundation in advanced mathematics and English in my previous life. Chinese was also barely okay. It was just that I had forgotten some ancient poems and essays, and my understanding of some question types needed improvement. As long as I put in some effort, there should be no problem in improving my grades. But when it came to physics, biology, and chemistry, looking at the textbooks was like looking at heavenly books to me. I couldn't understand them at all. How could I get the first place? I fell into deep thought. The next day, I got up with dark circles under my eyes. My mother had already prepared breakfast. There was a glass of hot milk, a fried egg, and 2 slices of toasted bread on the dining table. My mother herself was sitting in front of the computer at home looking at something. I took a sidelong glance and it was actually a page introducing stocks. TSK. My mother, this duplicitous woman. It seemed that my proposal yesterday still intrigued her. I immediately perked up and pulled my mother. Mom, guess who I dreamed about yesterday? I pretended to be mysterious. I dreamed about Grandpa. Grandpa told me that he was worried about us, mother and daughter, and asked me to tell you that you must buy a stock called Neptunus Bio. You'll surely make a fortune. In my memory, Neptunus Bio in 2009 was so wild that it was unrecognizable, with its amplitude reaching amplitude value at one point. It was a stock that could make you rich even if you bought it blindly. My mother immediately poked my forehead. I don't believe your nonsense. You can't even make up a lie properly. Grandpa hated speculation the most in his life. Would he tell you about stocks in a dream? Hurry up and finish your meal and go to school. I went to school dejectedly, thinking that there was no hope for the time being to support my mother, this puppet regime, in stock trading. I'd better hurry up and rely on myself to deal with Bitcoin. That day at school, Grace was showing off her newly bought mobile phone to me, saying it was a new semester gift from Dad. This plot was also familiar to me. It's just that the time when Grace got the new mobile phone was earlier than in my previous life. According to the timeline of my previous life, I had to wait until next semester when I asked my father for tuition fees and he refused. The next day, Grace would then show off her new mobile phone to me, saying, this was bought by Dad. Dad bought it especially for me to praise me for getting into the top 10 in the final exam. It's very expensive, but Dad said I'm worth it. At that time, I was so angry that I snatched her mobile phone and smashed it. And then that farce happened later. My mother was publicly accused by my father and stepmother of being ill-bred and not knowing how to educate children. Now that I think about it, Grace had always known that I had a hot temper. She deliberately came to show off her mobile phone in front of me. Nobody would believe that there was no intention behind it. At the moment, presumably because I embarrassed my stepmother yesterday, my father bought this new mobile phone for his cheap daughter to make up for it. Seeing Grace looking so smug, I immediately snatched her mobile phone. Just as I thought, the corners of Grace's mouth twitched upwards. Sure enough, she was indeed waiting for me to snatch her mobile phone and smash it. Too bad. I wasn't going to do what she wanted. I held her mobile phone above my head and then announced to the whole class in her expectant eyes. Take a look. Have a look. Stop and have a look. This is the new mobile phone that my father, Ethan, bought for Grace, his stepdaughter. But yesterday when my father divorced my mother, he told me personally that he had no money to support me and asked me to pretend that I didn't have a father like him. He has no money to support me, his own daughter, but he has money to buy a mobile phone for this stepdaughter. What do you think is the reason? The eyes of the whole class were focused on Grace and me. Grace knew that I wouldn't say anything nice, and at this moment, her face was as red as a cooked crab. She stood on tiptoe to reach for the mobile phone in my hand. I was a good half head taller than Grace. How could I let her reach it easily? While teasing Grace to run around me like teasing a little dog, I gave the answer. Of course it's because her mother is a vixen who seduced my father, this big scumbag, to abandon his wife and daughter. The classmates knew more or less about our family affairs. Even those classmates who had an ordinary relationship with me were full of sympathy for me. This poor little thing abandoned by my biological father. Moreover, in the past 6 months, Grace, relying on her mother hooking up with my father, had everything in terms of food, clothing, and use. She had a bit of the behavior of a poor man suddenly getting rich. She liked to show off her designer shoes, designer watches, and designer school bags in the class whenever she had the chance. Some people had already disliked her. At this time, when I stepped in to deal with her, it was both reasonable and understandable, and naturally, everyone responded enthusiastically. Therefore, as soon as I finished speaking, everyone burst into laughter. The few classmates who had a good relationship with me laughed especially loudly. Grace managed to hold back her tears. "Diana, this was bought by your father on his own initiative. You're just jealous of me," I snorted coldly. "What am I jealous of you for? Jealous that you have a mother who seduces other people's husbands? Or jealous that you'll have a father who'll end up in prison? Or jealous of your so-called family learning heritage? Like mother, like daughter. In the future, you can also go and find a sucker like my father, using someone else's daughter's tuition fees to buy a mobile phone for your daughter?" The classmates laughed even louder. Even with her thick skin and calculating mind, Grace couldn't help but be provoked by me into wanting to hit me. She raised her hand to slap me. But I'm a black belt. Level. Holder. How could she possibly succeed in slapping me? I tightly gripped her wrist and warned her, "I advise you. Don't push your luck when you've already got the benefits. Your stepfather bought you the mobile phone, and he thinks it's worth it. He's willing to be the sucker, and no one can say anything about that. But you're being cheap by running to show off in front of me, the victim. That's just asking for a beating. Today is a lesson for you. Stay away from me from now on. Otherwise, every time you come near me, I'll have to remind you what a despicable thing you and your mother are." My words were well-grounded and thought-provoking. The classmates who were watching not only cheered for me but some even clapped their hands. TSK, the mouths, the hands, and the power of the masses, I can easily utilize them. Grace finally couldn't bear it anymore and ran away, crying hysterically. The classmates gave me thumbs up one after another. Looking around the whole class, there was only one classmate who didn't give a thumbs up. But I saw his side face. He was burying his head and laughing. Obviously, he was also quite amused. I dug into my distant memories and recognized that this snickering male classmate was Henry, the top student in my previous life. He seemed to have been admitted to Harvard University in the end. My eyes lit up, and I walked towards Henry. "Henry, would you like to make a deal with me?" I was going to offer him a Bitcoin in exchange for him helping me with my studies. However, at this moment, Bitcoin sounded like a joke. I racked my brains to think about how to persuade him without making myself look like a fool. You've seen the situation in my family too. My father and stepmother are both waiting to see me make a fool of myself. As the saying goes, even if you don't steam buns, you still have to fight for your breath. I must do well in the college entrance examination. For the sake of our being classmates, could you please help me study hard? I don't have any other requests. Just let me borrow your notes to have a look. I won't let you help me for nothing. I'll give you a reward. Before I could even offer my big package of bitcoins, Henry actually stood up abruptly, as if he had been hit by a huge prize. His face turned red, whether from excitement or nervousness, I couldn't tell. "I'd like to." I looked at Henry. Henry looked at me. His face was red, but his eyes were bright, shining like stars. "I'd like to help you review and I don't want your reward. Is this kid a fool? It seems he doesn't know what he's going to get." I waved my hands repeatedly. No, you don't understand. What I'm giving you is really a huge fortune. If you don't want it, I'll insist on giving it to you because I'm afraid you'll regret it in the future." Just then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that Grace had actually come back. She was glaring at me with her eyes while crying. "TSK, what does that look mean? Afraid that I'll do better in my studies than her?" I was already smarter than her. In my previous life, my father spent God knows how much money on her to enroll her in review classes, and in the end, she only got into an ordinary key university. In this life, I think as long as I work hard, It'll be a piece of cake to beat her. I gave her a provoking look. Face the storm, sucker. This time, Grace actually looked at Henry with a look of longing. That look obviously wasn't the one of being afraid that I'd outperform her in studies. She likes Henry. That's great. I knew what to do. Under Grace's murderous gaze, Henry and I exchanged phone numbers and other relevant contact information. I winked at him playfully and told him we'd chat privately at night. His eyes were smiling into crescent shapes. He nodded, and his face turned red again. After getting Henry's help, I tossed my hair in Grace's direction and swaggered back to my seat. It's important to have Henry help me improve my grades, but even more important is that it can make Grace green with envy at the same time. In the following few days, I studied hard with Henry's help. No wonder he was a top student. On the notes he gave me, each knowledge point was analyzed clearly and precisely. The learning methods and problem-solving ideas were simple and clear. Coupled with my original foundation, I was full of confidence in the college entrance examination. Of course, I also didn't forget to secretly use the computer at home to start mining bitcoins. In just 1 week, I mined number coins to repay Henry for his selfless help. I decided to give him these coins directly. When I handed Henry the disk with the keys on it and told him to be sure to keep it until a year, I said to him, although you might not believe it if I tell you now, the blockchain technology represented by Bitcoin will surely bring huge changes to the world. Bitcoin will definitely become a new international currency in the future. You must believe me and keep these coins. Originally, I thought I'd be met with doubts or disdain and had prepared a whole bunch of words to persuade him. Unexpectedly, Henry was actually very happy and asked me, "You also know about Bitcoin? You also believe that blockchain will change the world?" My eyes lit up, and I looked at him with newfound respect. In an instant, it was as if we were long-lost siblings who had found and embraced each other in the vast sea of people. I don't know if it was because of Bitcoin, but since then, Henry regarded me as a bosom friend and often came to talk to me about Bitcoin after class. This made Grace extremely angry. Once, seeing that Henry and I were chatting congenially, she actually came over to ask what we were talking about. After Henry and I exchanged a glance, Henry said to her, "What we're talking about, I'm afraid you won't understand." The smile on the corner of his mouth made Grace seethe with anger. When Henry returned to his seat, Grace actually taunted me, saying that no matter how much I tried to cozy up to the top student, it was impossible for me to improve my grades. "You a slacker who ranks 30th or 40th in the class, don't waste Henry's precious study time. With the time you waste of his, he could do 2 more problems. Well, you a loser like this don't understand the value of the top student's time at all." Seeing that Grace was about to roll her eyes to the sky, I think I was being quite patient just listening to her up to this point. In front of the whole class, I didn't say a word but just slapped her hard across the face. Grace let out a howl and ran to the homeroom teacher to complain. I'm not afraid of you." When the homeroom teacher was dragged in by Grace, I was crying even louder than Grace. Both the homeroom teacher and Grace were stunned. With snot and tears streaming down my face, I said, "Teacher Alice." Grace taunted me. She said I was an idiot, just like my unfortunate mother, and no matter how much I studied, I'd still be an idiot. The homeroom teacher immediately gave Grace a look that clearly asked her if she had said such awful things, crying so hard that I could hardly catch my breath. I looked up at the homeroom teacher and asked, "Teacher, I want to study hard, so I asked Henry for advice. I want to make progress." "What does it have to do with her, Grace? Isn't it enough that she stole my father? Now she won't even let me study and make progress." The homeroom teacher was momentarily at a loss for words, and the look in her eyes when she looked at Grace became complicated. Of course, the homeroom teacher knew about the matter of Grace's mother stealing my father. So the next second, it was time for my most brilliant performance. Sobbing and stuttering, I said, "Teacher Alice, you're also a mother. You have children too. I want to ask you, if I were your child and the stepmother's child pointed at your nose and scolded you in front of me, wouldn't I be letting myself down if I didn't slap her? Wouldn't I be letting you down?" The root of all this is that Grace and her mother have gone too far. Her mother took my father, and the 2 of them took over my home. They even gave my room to Grace. Logically speaking, she has already got everything that originally belonged to me, but she still won't stop. She even wants to step on my face. It's obvious that she's not leaving me any way to live. Tell me, what on earth should I do? I was crying so hard that I was almost out of breath and soon I tugged at the homeroom teacher's heartstrings. Quick as a flash, the homeroom teacher immediately turned around and criticized Grace. Student Grace, one should know how to cherish what one has. Being too competitive makes a person seem narrow-minded. This incident is your fault. Student Diana's family changes are mainly the responsibility of your mother and you. Look at her pitiful appearance. The teacher feels sorry for her just looking at her. Don't bully others anymore. Grace looked at the homeroom teacher hopelessly, with a string of question marks in her eyes. Hee, with joy in my heart, I couldn't help but lower my head and laugh. Just when I thought I had smoothed this matter over, that afternoon my father and stepmother came to the school. Because it was a dispute between Grace and me, the homeroom teacher had to call me to the office too. As soon as I entered the office, I heard my stepmother and Grace wailing in front of the homeroom teacher. Grace's hair was disheveled, looking like she had been wronged after being punched by a boxer. My stepmother was hugging Grace, crying with pearly tears, constantly saying, "The child has been wronged. I'm such a useless mother." My father was standing aside, awkwardly rubbing his hands. Obviously, he also thought that this mother-daughter pair was overacting a bit. The homeroom teacher had a worried look on her face. She must have also felt that this matter was tricky and didn't seem to know how to solve it. "No problem. Since I'm here, I'll handle it. Woo 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 woo." As soon as I entered the door, I threw myself on the ground, crying even louder than my stepmother. "Aunt Amelia, please don't cry anymore. If you cry, Dad will get angry again." My father was stunned and immediately took a step back. He probably didn't expect me to pull such a stunt. I looked up at my father and immediately rushed forward, hugging his thigh. "Dad, don't be angry. I'll never annoy Grace again. I know I was wrong. If she hits my left cheek in the future, I'll offer her my right cheek. Don't be angry with me and don't refuse to pay my tuition fees, okay? I'm begging you." Just as my father was about to say something, I immediately interrupted him. "Dad, don't transfer me to another class or another school. I've just managed to keep up with the learning pace in the class. I still want to get into a good university to make you proud. Please, Dad, I really won't dare to annoy Grace anymore in the future. I'll do whatever she says. I can wash her clothes, bring her tea and water. I'll do anything." Apparently moved by my wonderful speech, the homeroom teacher had a look of hatred for evil on her face, glaring at my stepmother who was hugging Grace and my father who looked all flustered. I was crying and rubbing my snot and tears onto my father's trouser legs, getting his fancy suit pants all smeared with snot. My father looked disgusted, but in front of the homeroom teacher, he couldn't push me away at all. That helpless and comical look was both ridiculous and hateful. I only regretted that I couldn't take a camera to capture that moment. Perhaps because of my excellent acting skills, or perhaps because the homeroom teacher could tell right from wrong. Anyway, the homeroom teacher proposed to my father and stepmother that Grace must be transferred to another class. This isn't the first time Grace has bullied Diana. I don't care how you parents educate your children at home, but in my class I will never allow such things to happen. Now both children are in Senior 3, which is the most crucial moment in life. I don't want to see the two children fighting in my class anymore. Frankly speaking, their fighting not only affects themselves but also other classmates. So they must be separated. Having said that, the homeroom teacher clearly paused for a moment. It was at this moment that my stepmother cleverly picked up the conversation. "Teacher Alice, our Grace is in the top 10 of the class. I'm afraid that if she's transferred to another class, the child won't be able to adapt, and if she doesn't do well in the college entrance examination then, it'll be a huge trouble." My father also chimed in. "Yes, Grace studies better than Diana. Just transfer Diana to another class." The homeroom teacher was probably angered by my father's absurd remarks. She looked at my father sideways and said word by word, "Whether to transfer a student to another class or not doesn't depend on who has better grades. In my opinion, since it was Grace who started this incident, it's only reasonable that Grace should be the one to be transferred. I'll report this matter to the relevant school leaders, but as far as I'm concerned, it's settled for now." Listening to the homeroom teacher's passionate speech, I was in an extremely good mood, just like the fireworks on National Day, beautiful beyond words. After my stepmother and father left the school, I solemnly thanked the homeroom teacher, Teacher Alice. However, Teacher Alice held my hand and said a lot to me. "Diana, your family situation is rather complicated, but it shouldn't be a hindrance to your studies. Instead, it should be a motivation for you to study harder. I didn't tell your mother about what happened today because I heard that she's not in good health and I was afraid of adding to her burden. You should understand that you can't choose your parents, but you can choose your own life. The college entrance examination isn't as difficult as you imagine. As long as you work hard, you'll surely get into the school you desire. As long as I'm still your homeroom teacher, I'll unconditionally protect you, support you and do my best to clear the obstacles on your path to the college entrance examination. You're a good child. I believe that in the future, you'll successfully pass through every crossroad in life and become the adult you want to be. Don't be afraid, child. You have me here at school. The teacher's words moved me to tears again. This time it was real crying. Actually, the homeroom teacher was also very kind to me in my previous life. She put a lot of effort into helping me get into junior college. In this life, if I get the chance, I'll definitely repay her kindness well. After school, as soon as I walked out of the school gate, I saw my mother waiting for me there. At first I thought that my father had complained to my mother about me, so I walked up to her a bit guiltily. To my surprise, my mother was beaming with joy. Let's go, Mom will treat you to Pizza Hut. Thank goodness it was just Pizza Hut. Following my mother into Pizza Hut, my mother waved her hand grandly and ordered a stuffed crust pizza, chicken wings, sirloin steak, tiramisu, matcha ice cream cake, prawns and escargots and red wine sauce all in one go. I quickly grabbed her hand to stop her from ordering. That's enough, Mom. If we order so much, what about our next meal? My mother laughed heartily. Can't your mom run into something good for a change? Just eat to your heart's content today. Mom will make sure you have enough. I quickly asked my mother what good things she had encountered. Instead, my mother asked me mysteriously. First, tell me, has Grandpa given you another dream these 2 days? It turned out that although my mother had said she didn't want to buy the Neptunus bio stock, her actions were quite honest. In her words, I thought I'd just take out 10,000 yuan to give it a try. What if Grandpa really gave you accurate information in the dream? Unexpectedly, that Neptunus bio stock is really amazing. Since I bought it, it has doubled in price. Who would have thought that Grandpa is really something? Looking at my mother's glowing face at the moment, there was no trace of the depression she had in her previous life. Sure enough, only getting rich can make people forget all the unpleasantness. I found it a bit funny, but more than that I was happy. Of course Grandpa is something. He told me yesterday that this stock could go up 5 times. He told you not to sell it in a hurry. Ah, my mother was shocked, but I've already sold it. Just when I thought my mother was going to blame me for not telling her the information from Grandpa's dream earlier, she already raised her glass. Oh well, doubling our money is not bad either. It's still worth celebrating. Let's have a toast. So my mother is such a free-spirited and contented person by nature. But in my previous life I hardly ever saw her in such a relaxed state as she is now. It can be seen how hard my mother's life was in my previous life. I raised my glass full of juice and clinked it with my mother's. Well, Grandpa was right. He said you're an impatient person and you must have sold that stock early. But it doesn't matter. He told me the names of a few more stocks. This time, you have to listen to him. Don't sell until he tells you to. That night when we mother and daughter went home after having our fill, my mother held my hand and said to me, Diana, we'll surely get better and better. I tightly hugged my mother's neck. Of course, we'll definitely get better and better. You'll become the happiest mother in the world, and I'll become the happiest mama's girl in the world. Not long after that, following my grandfather's messages from the dream, my mother bought several stocks one after another. The result was of course that she made a fortune. My mother also looked more energetic day by day. After school I could even often hear her humming songs unconsciously. Doing my homework while listening to my mother's singing, I felt that my life had never been as happy and content as it was at that moment. Since Grace was transferred to another class, my world has been a lot quieter. Every day following Henry to fill in the gaps in my knowledge. More than a month later my grades had indeed improved a lot and had already exceeded the first-tier university admission line in our province. The homeroom teacher especially praised me during the monthly exam summary and asked everyone to learn from me. Henry was also very happy. He actually told me that he was full of confidence in helping me get into Harvard University. Haha, hearing him say that, I'm also feeling a bit confident now. Just when I thought that life was peaceful and everything was going smoothly, Grace showed up in our class with a lot of nerve. I thought she was coming to pick on me, but who would have known that she was here to hand out invitations? There were 45 people in the class, and she handed out 44 invitations. Saying that it was Halloween on the weekend and coincidentally it was her birthday, and she invited everyone to party together at the new villa her parents had just bought. The person who didn't receive an invitation was, of course, me. You all must come. We study so seriously every day and we should also relieve some mental stress appropriately. Don't worry. It's all on me. You don't need to bring gifts either. I just thought that we'll all be working hard in the next 6 months, and I hope we can have a great get-together. Grace said these words in a pretentious tone, making it hard for people not to think that she was showing off. I took a glance at the invitation my deskmate received. Well, I almost laughed my head off. The address of Grace's new home was actually in a villa area that was forcibly demolished by the government in early year. Back then, this villa area had quite a powerful background, so its being listed as an illegal construction and forcibly demolished attracted the attention of people all over the country. To confirm, I took the invitation from my deskmate and looked at it carefully. It was indeed that villa area. It seemed that my father and stepmother couldn't stay in the original community anymore. Somehow they were coaxed by someone and bought a house in that supposedly high-end villa area. Well, as the saying goes, look up and you'll see that heaven spares no one. Oh my mood was cheerful again. But I still didn't plan to let this overly pretentious Grace off the hook. She had the nerve to come in front of me to show off. She really is one who forgets the pain once the wound heals, treating me like I'm nobody. I started getting ready, preparing to find the right moment to give this pretender a precise strike. Since there were few people who responded, Grace kept telling everyone that she had ordered enough KFC for everyone. And when she said these things, her eyes were fixed on Henry. Many classmates seemed to have seen through Grace's intention and started to tease a little. Only Henry was still reading his book with his head down. Seeing that Henry didn't look up, Grace simply walked up to him. Henry, you must come on the weekend. I have some questions to ask you. Grace's tone was all cutesy and her body was almost twisted like a twisty pretzel, just like my stepmother. Now, the eyes of the whole class were focused on Henry. Henry looked up slightly, his tone calm. I don't have time that day. I've made an appointment with Diana to help her review. Don't come to me in the future either. I don't have time. I have a lot of my own things to do. With that, the whole class went quiet, and 90 big eyes all turned to look at me. My face suddenly turned red. Out of shyness. Grace's face also turned red. Out of anger. I have to say, Henry's words made me seem gentle and virtuous all of a sudden. I didn't dare to look at him, and I was completely in no mood to think about how to strike back at Grace anymore. All I could think was, I'm fangirling over myself now. Grace probably didn't expect that she would be rejected by Henry in public, and it was in the name of having an appointment with me. She covered her face and ran out of our class at lightning speed. As soon as she left, our class immediately erupted. Amid the countless teasing voices, I heard a few girls asking, did I come too late? Has the baby been born? Damn it, they're just like when I'm fangirling. They really are my classmates. Since Grace had already run away, I couldn't chase after her to strike back. After being stunned for a few seconds, the homeroom teacher came in to announce the start of class. During this class, I really didn't listen for a single minute. Taking advantage of the moment when the teacher turned around to wipe the blackboard, I took a furtive glance at Henry. He was also looking at me. Oh no. I felt that my chance of getting into Harvard University might be ruined. After class, I rushed out of the classroom immediately. In my plan, there was no item about having a puppy love. However, I was really charmed by Henry's words just now. Could it be that he really has feelings for me? After washing my face 3 times with cold water, I walked out of the girls' bathroom. I bumped into Henry, who had just walked out of the boys' bathroom. The water droplets on Henry's face told me that he had also washed his face with cold water. Our eyes met, and there were pink bubbles. I wanted to run again, but he grabbed me. Diana, let's get into Harvard University together. Before the college entrance examination, we won't make any promises to each other. We'll just do our best to work hard and strive. After the college entrance examination, we'll become real adults. Then, we'll discuss our future together, okay? I turned around and met his sincere and determined eyes. After nodding vigorously, I said, yes, we must be together in the future, to deal with Bitcoin. Honestly, in my previous life, I had never been in a serious relationship. In this life at the age of 18, although I like him a lot, it's still hard for me to say mushy words. I don't have much experience, after all. This be together to deal with Bitcoin is already my limit. Henry laughed and told me that it was a deal. After getting home, although I felt a bit regretful for not being able to give Grace, who was showing off in front of me, a precise strike, the matter of their buying a house still gave me a new inspiration. I dug into my distant memories. In early 2010, due to planning reasons, the housing prices in the community where our original home was located soared, doubling in just 1 year. So, I started to persuade my mother to buy a small house in our original community. My mother's first reaction was to disagree. She said she didn't want me to live in the original environment again, fearing that some rumors would affect my college entrance examination. Moreover, she would have to see my father and them frequently, which was quite disgusting. I earnestly told my mother that the community was close to the school, and that my father and them had already bought a house and moved away. If it was really for the sake of my studies, we should move back to that community. I was especially afraid that my mother would refuse again. Then I would have to bring up the excuse of my grandfather's message in a dream. Fortunately, this time my mother didn't directly refuse. She just said that she didn't have enough savings and couldn't afford to buy a house in that community for the time being. Diana, Mom knows you've been wronged. How about we rent a house in that community first? How could that be okay? After some struggling, I still brought up my grandfather. This time I successfully persuaded my mother. We paid half of the down payment and the other half was borrowed from the bank with a 30-year mortgage and bought a 2-bedroom apartment in the original community. A month later, when we were taking possession of the house, the news came on the TV that the villa area where my father and them lived had been forcibly demolished by the government's order. The moment we learned this news, my mother was hanging the curtains in our new home. She yanked open the newly bought curtain and the golden sunlight at noon immediately filled the whole living room. We looked at each other and smiled and everything was understood without words. At that time I thought that in a year I would strive to make my mother's stock income reach 1 million. Plus the money from selling this house we could buy 2 or 3 houses in the new district and they could appreciate in value again. My mother would surely be happy to be a landlady. Early the next morning I was awakened by a commotion. Walking out of the bedroom I saw that it was my stepmother Amelia and my mother who were pulling each other's hair at the front door. Amelia was tugging at my mother's hair and my mother was also tightly grabbing Amelia's braids. Although it seemed that my mother wasn't at a disadvantage this time, either my anger still flared up immediately. If you're asking for a beating, don't blame me for being rude. I took a big stride forward and tightly clamped Amelia's neck. Amelia could only let go of my mother to save herself. Then I gave her an over-the-shoulder throw and threw her to the ground. This throw was probably a bit too forceful. Amelia lay on the ground without moving for a full 2 minutes. Just when I was a bit worried that I might have killed her, she let out a howl. Elizabeth! You shameless vixen! You're still seducing other people's husbands even after getting divorced, making other people's husbands spend money on you. I don't want to live anymore. If you have the guts, kill me. If you don't, spit out the money my husband gave you. A mistress coming to the legitimate wife to scold her as a vixen. This crazy operation almost made me laugh out of anger. My mother's face turned livid. Amelia, you think everyone in the world is as shameless as you. If you leave now, I won't hold you accountable. If you don't leave, I'll call the police and sue you for slander. Amelia spat at my mother with a paw. We're all 1,000-year-old foxes. Don't pretend to be so noble here. If you didn't spend my husband's money, where did you get the money to buy a house? Elizabeth, oh Elizabeth, you're supposed to be some young lady. What's the difference between you seducing men and those women who sell themselves outside? Letting other people's husbands spend money on you to buy a house. You're utterly heartless. You deserve to die a horrible death. I originally thought that my mother should be extremely angry and was just about to slap Amelia a few more times on behalf of my mother. Unexpectedly, my mother burst out laughing. Amelia, you're absolutely right, so right. Whoever seduces other people's husbands to spend money on themselves is utterly heartless and deserves to die a horrible death. In my lifetime, I never expected that I could actually hear such a human-like sentence from you. I'm so relieved. Too bad I'm not like you. I'm just lucky. I don't need to use such despicable means to seduce men to spend money on me like you do. Before I married Ethan, I was the apple of my father's eye. My father was willing to spend money on me wholeheartedly. I married Ethan and I had my own job. I spent my own money with full confidence. Now I've divorced Ethan. Guess what? My own daughter has become a stock market wizard. Whenever my daughter says a stock is good, that stock immediately goes up. You want to know where my money came from? I'm not afraid to tell you. I rely on my daughter. I don't know how much money I've made in this half year. Not only did I buy a house, but I'm going to buy a car tomorrow. Isn't that annoying? Amelia looked completely disbelieving. Pa, who are you trying to fool here? Your daughter has become a stock market wizard. If your daughter can become a stock market wizard, I'll take your surname. Amelia's shouting had already attracted the neighbors to come and watch. At this time, the neighbors came forward one after another to testify, proving that my identity as a stock market wizard was well deserved. For example, Grandma Wong, the neighbor, said that the stock she bought under my guidance had gone up. Anjong downstairs also said that the stock she bought following my mother had made her a lot of money. Before, when people said that the blessed don't enter the unblessed families, I thought it was a bit mysterious. But now I really believe it. Look at Elizabeth. Since she divorced Ethan, her life has been getting better and better. But look at Ethan. He sold the nice house he was living in, and I heard that the villa he bought was even forcibly demolished. Now it seems that Ethan's previous prosperity was all thanks to Elizabeth's good fortune. Without Elizabeth, he's nothing. Right. Some people are just doomed to be poor. Whoever marries them will be unlucky. Amid the neighbors whispering, Amelia's face quickly turned ashen. My father showed up at some point. He yanked Amelia up from the ground. Hurry up and get out of here. Don't make a fool of yourself here. In full view of everyone, Amelia lost face and her eyes were brimming with tears. Too bad her tears didn't work on my father anymore. He gave her a disgusted look. Stop fucking crying. Aren't you afraid of bad luck? Amelia's face turned pale and finally she slunk away with my father. After this encounter, I suddenly realized that actually in this life I don't need to bother taking revenge on my father and my stepmother's family. Just the fact that we bought a second-hand house was enough to make my stepmother furious. If we lived even better, wouldn't she be driven to hang herself? With this realization, I suddenly felt like everything was clear in front of me. My mother and I must live an extremely good life. So while I was studying hard and following the tips from my grandfather's supposed messages and dreams, I finally managed to give my father a cerebral hemorrhage out of anger in the summer of year. Actually, we didn't do anything excessive. It was just that I got into Harvard University, my mother made her first million from stock trading, and we sold the house in the original community at twice the price. And then when they begged me to reveal the magic stocks, we refused. That's all. Here's what happened. Not long after hearing that it was true that my mother had made a fortune from stock trading, Amelia and my father actually showed up at our door again, this time even carrying a box of fruits. They vowed that they had been blind and underestimated the talents of my mother and me before. Now that their villa had been forcibly demolished and there were problems with their company's operation, they earnestly begged my mother and me to save them. Elizabeth, Diana, I'm sorry for what I did to you before. But now I'm really at the end of my rope. Just take pity on me and let me join you in stock trading. After all, I'm Diana's biological father. My father pleaded with my mother in a whiny voice, and his eyes looked like cheap plastic. My stepmother was being all humble beside him. Yes, Elizabeth. I was wrong before. You're so magnanimous. Please help us. We all have children. Just take pity on the children. My mother laughed and threw the fruits they brought out the door. Oh dear, Mom is still angry. I think only if you kneel down might Mom forgive you. I deliberately played a trick on them. Unexpectedly, Ethan actually took it seriously and really pulled Amelia to kneel down in front of my mother. These two old fools really don't care about their knees for the sake of money. When my mother saw that my father and stepmother actually knelt down, a look of disgust flashed across her face. What Ethan said next made my mother and me laugh even harder. To be honest, although I divorced you these past few years, I've really regretted it. The expression on the face of my stepmother, who was kneeling on the ground, was priceless. But for the sake of getting rich, she endured it with all her might. Sure. After divorcing my mother, you've been haunted by bad luck. I'd say marriage is no joke. Marrying an unlucky wife will ruin all your wealth. I stared at my stepmother intently, enjoying the look of extreme restraint on her face. Ethan kept nodding in agreement and then asked my mother if she could forgive him now that he had knelt down. Before my mother could say anything, I cut in. I asked my father with a smile, Ethan, do you remember what you said to me when I asked you for tuition fees that year? My father was stunned. Obviously, he had completely forgotten what he had said before. At that time, you said that your money didn't come from thin air. Well, now I'll send you a message. My money does come from thin air, but I just won't give it to you. Get out. As soon as I finished speaking, I used a mop to sweep these two unlucky wretches out of the door. After Ethan left, my mother, afraid that I would be sad, held my hand and said a lot of things to me. Basically, she meant that in this life, she couldn't give me a father who loved me, and she was very sorry about that. I hugged my mother and said to her affectionately, "Not having a father who loves me isn't my fault, nor is it Mom's fault. There are many fates in one's life. We should cherish the good ones doubly and quickly distance ourselves from the bad ones. I'm only years old. There's still a lot of future in my life. I believe that as long as I'm with Mom and as long as Mom lives comfortably, I'll have the motivation to strive for other greater happiness. Please, Mom, rest assured and believe in me, believe in us." My mother cried. She stroked my cheek and asked me, "When did you grow up? How did you become so sensible?" I smiled and said, "Because Grandpa sent me a message in a dream, asking me to be sensible and not cause trouble for his daughter." My mother laughed and cried, saying that I was talking nonsense, but at the same time, she looked up at the sky, lost in thought. Looking at my innocent and sweet mother, I was really happy. In this life, I'm the guardian angel of my mother. Extra chapter. To repay my homeroom teacher who had always supported and protected me, I asked my mother to tell her the names of the stocks. Soon, the homeroom teacher also became a little rich woman. On the day I received the admission notice from Harvard University, Henry officially confessed his love to me. His way of confessing was to give me number Bitcoins that he had mined day and night during the summer vacation. Holding the disk containing this huge fortune, I decided that he would be the one for me in this life. After becoming a rich woman, my mother directly applied for early retirement within the company. She signed up for the dance classes that she had always wanted to take in her previous life and was finally going to step onto the stage. Since Ethan was ridiculed at my place and on top of that had the reputation of being haunted by bad luck after favoring his concubine and neglecting his wife, all his former business partners thought he was bad luck and abandoned him, and his business plummeted. Under multiple blows, he soon had a cerebral hemorrhage just like in his previous life. Amelia complained bitterly and quickly filed for divorce from him, but Ethan just wouldn't divorce her. In this life, Ethan probably really believed those widespread rumors like, Amelia is the chief culprit who brought him bad luck, and hated Amelia to the core. He even threatened to drag her down with him even if it meant dying together. So later, in front of the fruit store that Amelia opened, people often saw my paralyzed father causing trouble for her in the store. The two of them were locked in this cycle of revenge, and neither of them had the time to bother me. This was an unexpected delight for me. As for Grace, because she had been in a bad mood since being transferred to another class and her mother had always been asking her to compete with me, she failed to get into an undergraduate program due to her depressed mood and went to an unknown school instead. Later, my mother and I left our small town. Our own lives were so wonderful that no one really cared about the lives of that family anymore. After all, after hearing too many unlucky stories, people are afraid of getting bad luck themselves.